Hi, Steve Carlson here. Well, I want to note that today Hillary Clinton is in town, Bernie Sanders, Martin O'Malley, all the Democratic candidates are here in town in Minnesota, in Minneapolis, and they've already announced a new fundraising deal in which Hillary, the former Secretary of State, who is sinking in the hearts of her countrymen because she insists it was all right to keep classified documents on their private email servers, as well as her special assistant, Uma Abedin, and her attorney, her and Bill's attorney, Cheryl Mills. And they have destroyed servers and the like, so she's falling. Not first in the hearts of her countrymen right now, but they have a new fundraising contract where Hillary, as a celebrity, will be raising funds jointly with the DNC and with four state Democratic parties, including New Hampshire, just to raise funds for the Democratic Party. And they say they hate Citizens United, they hate money and politics and all of that, but they want to repeal the First Amendment, but they have this new fundraising deal. And that's not all. They are trying every trick in the book, the Democrats are, to prevent the U.S. Constitution from being followed, from having free and fair elections in 2016. Because the Constitution requires the United States, this is in Article 4, Section 1, it says, the United States shall guarantee to every state in this union a Republican form of government, unquote. That's the guarantee clause. And the Democrats, using Minnesota courts, using the DFL Constitution, and tons of constitutions like it across the country, backed by the force of state law and state action, are preventing that. Just as one example, I'm raising in the U.S. Supreme Court. We have the Minnesota voter quota, which I know all the Democrats in the country use. It's got all kinds of quotas for gender, race, sexual, whatever. But just think about it. Amy Klobuchar, first woman senator. How did she do that? Well, the law requires that the people endorsing the DFL candidate for Senate, more than 50% of them have to be women. So Amy's a woman, yay. And white males are limited to 35 to 40% of the endorsing delegates. So who do you think is going to be endorsed? That's right, the first woman. And now Hillary Clinton's coming to Minnesota and many other states like California and Texas, and I still haven't surveyed all the states, but she's going to get a majority of the delegates for president in the DFL and these other states just because she's a woman, and the majority of people who want to elect the first woman, well, they have to be women by law for the Democrats. Now that's not a Republican form of government, is it? Because it is the people, it is the independent voters, not the two major parties, and not some limited demographic special interest like women or any other group, that is to select a representative in Washington or as president. That's what Republican form of government means. And further, this violates the 19th Amendment, because that amendment requires that you cannot abridge or deny anyone's right to vote on account of their sex. And the 15th Amendment, that you cannot abridge or deny anyone's right to vote on account of their race. And this also violates the First Amendment, right to freedom of association. You don't have to associate by all this social engineering, so many women over here, so many straight guys over here, and so forth. And Hillary's facing Donald Trump. And Donald Trump is the independent person who has taken over the election, currently taken over the Republican Party. Trump is an independent with $1 billion, leading the Republican nomination process right now, and has for a long time. He's giving substantively the same message that I have. But I have greatly respected his ability to apply management skills and bring his negotiation skills to a presidential election, building on work he began as far back as 2000 or before. And in 2000, he won the California primary for president. Did you know that? According to Wikipedia. For the Reform Party. And Jesse Ventura was in there and Pat Buchanan. Now, Trump is an independent candidate. Looking back at Anderson versus Calabrese, 1983, U.S. Supreme Court, which is the cornerstone of this case that I'm bringing to the U.S. Supreme Court. And that case is just a beautiful case in which the U.S. Supreme Court said It is to be expected that a voter hopes to find on the ballot a person who comes near to reflecting his policy preferences on contemporary issues. The right to vote is heavily burdened if that vote may be cast only for major party candidates. That's Democrats and that's Republicans. At a time when other parties or other candidates are clamoring for a place on the ballot. The exclusion of candidates also burdens voters' freedom of association, because an election campaign is an effective platform for the expression of views on the issues of the day, and a candidate serves as a rallying point for like-minded citizens, and you can see that with Donald Trump. And now, Virginia and some other states are trying to bring down the successful independent candidate Donald Trump, knock him out of the Republican primary by making him sign a paper saying he promises not to run as an independent. And I can only say to the Republicans, warn the Republicans that they have to read Anderson versus Celebrezzi, because they did the same thing to John B. Anderson, tried to stop him from running as an independent. You so often hear how the trumped-up Supreme Court, these stodgy people who look down on all the common people, but this really makes sense, this Anderson versus Celebrezzi. Well, here in Minnesota, we've had some cases too, some good, some bad. A bad one was Al Franken. I have said Al is the choice of the court, and we the voters would like to have a say on having Al in the Senate or not. But we've got judges here on the Minnesota Supreme Court and other courts who themselves run for election. And that's been to the U.S. Supreme Court too. And these judges are refusing to enforce Minnesota election law. And they gleefully have tried to snuff out the Minnesota Independence Party. That's the Reform Party, the party of Jesse Ventura, and the party for which Donald Trump won the California primary in 2000 for president, according to what I read on Wikipedia. The national parties are manipulating state laws and state courts to ensure that they can just cakewalk their hand-selected, programmed candidates onto the ballot. So in this case, we have, first of all, the Republicans running the Supreme Court in Minnesota. And we have Alan Page, a former Minnesota Viking Hall of Famer, I believe. He's just been retired as a member of that Minnesota Supreme Court because he hit 70. But the biggest thing that the Supreme Court did during his time was to mess up the elections, to prevent free and fair elections, prevent a Republican form of government in this state. And that's the biggest story in the Minnesota Supreme Court history during Alan Page's time, and the whole country is watching over a decade. They overrode the law, thereby killing free and fair elections on many levels. First level is by choosing to narrow down the laws to be enforced, because nobody believes that the laws are going to be enforced in any other way than the Minnesota Supreme Court. So when they handpick incumbents like Al Franken or gender favorites like Hillary Clinton or Amy Klobuchar, maybe even Rosalie Wall, they pull all these dirty tricks, which I have carefully detailed for the courts, and you can see in my other videos. They know the Minnesota Supreme Court, Alan Page, Lori Gildea, and the like, will be like, hear no evil, see no evil. What has happened here, then, is that the state of Minnesota, through the Supreme Court, has, using the Franken election against Coleman in 2009, established that it will strictly limit its carrying out of its duties. Now, this flies in the face of the Supreme Court, who have ruled that courts have an unflagging obligation to exercise jurisdiction where it is given to them, to exercise it. Instead, what our Minnesota Supreme Court has done to help people like Hillary Clinton is to go hard to identity politics. That is to say, picking judges and candidates for federal office based on their race, based on their sex, etc., and to violate free speech. And they have already been overturned by the U.S. Supreme Court in 2002 in Republican Party of Minnesota versus White. And in that case, Justice Scalia warned the Minnesota political establishment, the two big national parties, that there is an obvious tension between Minnesota's Constitution, which requires judicial elections and requires a lot of protections for federal Congress, including that they will not exercise jurisdiction over those contests. Those are saved for the United States Senate itself or the U.S. House of Representatives. But our Constitution also requires judicial elections. Judges have to be elected. They never are. They're always re-elected with nobody knowing what they stand for but the ABA handpicking them. But they're always appointed by the governors. And somehow the Minnesota Supreme Court has signed off on this so that they sign off on they don't have to be elected. And there's this tension, said Scalia, between that and a clause prohibiting the judge from announcing his or her views, so they couldn't talk about the issues. And Scalia says this places most subjects of interest to the voters off limits, so they can't hear. The First Amendment, says Scalia in the Supreme Court, does not permit Minnesota to leave the principle of elections in place while preventing candidates from discussing what the elections are about, their views on disputed legal issues or political issues. And yet, Al Franken was allowed to avoid even having one single debate, either a broadcast debate or a non-broadcast debate, with the major political party nominee for the Independence Party, Trump's party, Jesse Ventura's party, who was elected statewide in a primary for the U.S. Senate. And these judges sat by and did nothing. They refused to apply Minnesota's election laws. And in fact, Michael Davis, who is the chief judge of the Minnesota federal court here, and he is the first black federal judge for Minnesota from Ohio, where he's from, or from anywhere. So you understand, he loves identity politics and identity decisions. And he has tried to strike down the rights of candidates in a judicial election for the Minnesota Supreme Court itself, to tell the voters what their positions on issues are. In that Minnesota Supreme Court case that went to the U.S. Supreme Court on election judges, and this one actually came from the federal court, Michael Davis's federal court, and it was overturned at the U.S. Supreme Court. And in that, Greg Wursel, he's a lawyer, he went to Republicans and to the voters, and he distributed literature. Oh my. And Davis, who is touted as the first black judge, struck down Wursel's right to say he would be a strict constructionist, saying in effect, we don't need voters to be allowed to hear debates and other communication from candidates. We have identity politics. By the way, Davis is also the federal judge here in Minnesota who waded in to uphold the Minnesota voter quota law in 2012. But in an opinion dismissing Wursel's case, which was ultimately upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court, Davis said voters don't need to hear the candidates' views to have a robust debate. Rosalie Wall, he says, had a great re-election. Again, in Minnesota, all the governors first appoint a judge, and then they face a, quote, re-election by the voters, having never been elected. Well, Rosalie Wall's politics are just like Hillary Clinton's. Blatant gender-based politics. And Wall was appointed by Rudy Perpich to be Chief Justice of the Minnesota Supreme Court. And Davis said in that case that there was a robust re-election campaign for Rosalie Wall. Again, they're never elected here, always appointed in violation of our Minnesota Constitution. Davis said we don't need elections on the issues, and this is what Rosalie Wall ran on instead and left as her legacy, which people in the Star Tribune, like Lori Sturdivant, praise. She said, how can women judges make our increased participation most meaningful to the interests of other women and of our society? Now that enough women are in the bar and on the bench to form a mass, a critical mass large enough to be a catalyst, what are our responsibilities for change? Women with access to power and status must not allow this to separate them from their knowledge of what it means to be female in this society. Certainly every woman of accomplishment owes it to another woman to reach out and assist her growth and aspiration. We are responsible, socially and individually, for helping other women achieve their desired goals. Thus, in our sphere, our own sphere, we work for the election or appointment of women judges to the bench. You don't usually hear that much candor. But that is exactly what is going on in this election with Hillary Clinton. Once there, said Rosalie Wall, we expect and anticipate women judges will fulfill expectations of judicial excellence. How can you expect judicial excellence when the basis for your selection is not excellence, but your gender? Now, so instead of allowing Minnesota voters to hear a discussion of positions on legal issues, like the role of the Constitution in lawsuits, we hear cheerleading to breaking down the composition of the courts, or the Congress, or the presidency, so women can reach their desired goals, so blacks can reach their desired goals, which isn't working. So immigrants can reach their desired goals, so homosexuals and lesbians can reach their desired goals. Is it any wonder that our nation under this Democratic leadership is descending into chaos, that our position in the world is undermined, that our stock market, economy, education is plummeting, and our families being destroyed, and human life once again bought and sold, only this time in a butcher shop for baby parts and tissues? Even as Hillary Clinton sinks in the hearts and minds of her countrymen and appeals for record-high fundraising for election soundbites, she stridently attacks these values, which most Americans wish to restore to their rightful place. In Cleveland yesterday, she chided, extreme views about women, we expect that from some of the terrorist groups. We expect that from people who don't want to live in the modern world. But it's a little hard to take coming from Republicans who want to be president of the United States, unquote. Whoa. I urge that the courts allow the voters, the independent voters, and their candidates and parties back on the ballot, continue to enforce our rights, and that we turn away from this senselessly partisan identity politics and back to basics, back to the issues. I'm Steve Carlson. I'm running for president as an independent in 2016, and I approve this message. Welcome to Minneapolis.